Thanks for joining us for our next installment of our small group study. Chad, would you read for us?
Yeah, James 1, starting in verse 2. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing.
James is an interesting book, primarily for the reason that it's not oriented around the recipients. We don't really know what the target audience here was, or who this was being sent to. All the other books of the Bible or the epistles are, if it's a letter to First Corinthians, it's therefore dealing with the problems that they're dealing with. James is not like that.
Yeah, I guess this is more got some universal application that you could take and apply it anywhere, and it's not just dealing with specific issues of a particular group and stuff like that. And but I also maybe get the feeling that maybe some people have kind of taken some of Paul's teaching and some of Paul's epistles and kind of run into error with them, and he's kind of trying to correct that a little bit as well.
Yeah, and I think that the uniqueness of James is, makes it a very interesting book to look over and to study. And the first thing we get here is that James has a structure that's reminiscent of the wisdom literature. And so, what is it about James that reminds people of that?
When you look at the book of Proverbs and stuff like that, you get a lot of little nuggets that I guess are part of a complete whole, but could be little standalone nuggets as well. And you see some of the same things in James, and you might get two or three verses that are all kind of connected around a real quick theme. It might talk about the tongue and to be wary of its use and things of this sort and be careful. And then it might dive off into talking about the purpose of trials and so maybe in that sense.
Yeah, and I think that it's an interesting book because it covers a lot of different topics. It's the information that James gives is very distilled down. You don't get the sense that he's just kind of stream of consciousness, but that these are things that he's learned through experience, but he's been able to distill down the essence into just a few lines. But here we get at the beginning this idea of trials and tribulations, and why might James be starting his book with this?
Same reason we see it addressed often, right? Is in all likelihood those we don't know who again the particular audience is, but there's a good chance in the first century that's somewhere great many of them are facing persecution.
It's almost a given, I think, that as the early church faced persecution, that they're going to be facing these things. As modern readers, we're not under that same situation, but it doesn't mean that application is absent from our lives. So where do we find the application for this?
I think we find it more commonly maybe today than maybe in our parents' generation and stuff like this. But it's one of those things too that if you really want to live a truly Christian life, it's going to be a little bit countercultural, and you might face a little bit of social persecution, if you will, and in some cases, even within the church, you might still face some social persecution if you're really trying to live, what the Bible says.
There are some people that believe that one of the major components of our current modern culture is Gnosticism, and one of the tenets of Gnosticism was that this physical world is just evil. And in fact, it was created by a demiurge that was evil, and its job is to imprison us. And they saw the all the things that don't go our way are kind of evidence that this is the case. When you look at James and his advice about trials and tribulations, I think that you get a glimpse into a much bigger theological perspective. So what might that perspective have to say to a modern culture who has a tendency to see everything that doesn't agree with my desires to be evil?
The phrase embrace the suck that you brought up in the context of the military comes to mind, and it's one of those things like we obviously value comfort very highly on the scale, whether we admit it or not, in our modern culture. And And unfortunately, that doesn't often produce the perfection that James talks about, and letting have its full effect, and things of this sort. And maybe we need to do a better job of allowing a place for suffering. I'm not saying we should, go out and find suffering anywhere we can and embrace it, but when it comes our way, not to shriek back, and to really kind of take seriously what James says, to count it all joy. This is an opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that there's an inherent distrust of God and the world that He created in kind of our modern attitude to the world. And how does that shape us spiritually?
It almost leaves us thinking that God's a little capricious, or maybe that God's not super invested in this world that He created. But believing in the sovereignty of God, so to speak, and that everything that crosses our paths has been allowed by Him, and that includes being oppressed, and being you can think of all the great evils that occur, and at some level God is still sovereign. He's still on the throne, and suffering still has a place to perfect us.
Yeah, I think that just this idea that it's amazing how ingrained and how naturally it comes to us, and so it's not hard to see how that Gnostic perspective finds a very welcome home in the hearts of almost any person that's alive. That this idea that somehow I'm the standard, that my view of right and wrong, my view of fair and unfair, that anytime the world doesn't conform to my wishes, that somehow there's been an injustice done. It's amazing how easily that kind of resides within us. And what is it about trials and tribulations? I mean, obviously they can bring forth a lot of kind of bitterness and resentment toward us, but what's the alternative? What's the benefit that James is trying to derive from that?
I mean, it brings humility. At least it can, right? It really usually you either go down the bitter path or the humble path, and it can kind of stop you in your tracks and make you reevaluate and kind of just take an inventory and be like, okay, this suffering, I would like it to cease. Is there anything I'm doing that contributes to this, and is there something to be gained here? But it really is just a time to take an account, and it might make you humble enough to be teachable.
It seems to me that the idea of faith could be seen as a thread that draws these things together. Here are the good things that happened in my day, and here are the bad things that happened in my day. Here are the good relationships I have. Here are the bad. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Sure.
And it seems like what he's saying is that perspective might not be accurate. Would you agree with that, or?
Sure, no, absolutely. And I remember you saying something once upon a time and talking about exactly this kind of thing, of things that are good and things that are bad, and somebody saying, well, it's a God thing. Mm-hmm. And usually it's some great thing that happened. And but if something that brings a little bit of suffering came along, you wouldn't hear somebody go, that's a God thing. But maybe there's a place to consider that as well.